Sorry that the last video cut off. I didn't have enough memory left on my family video camera because I had a bunch of clips of my daughters, and then it went off, and so I tried to restart the camera myself to do the rest of the video, but it turned out I cut off part of my head, and I was going to post that version of the video, but my wife said it looks ridiculous. So I'm going to try again. Here's the rest of the lecture. As I remember, we left off where I was just about to start the fourth heading and talk to you about the Bible in English. We talked about the writing of the Bible, the formation of the canon, the copying of the Bible text, and now just think for a minute about the Bible in English. All those copies of the Bible were made in Greek and Hebrew and then Latin. So how did we get it into English? Well, you have a good article that tells you some about how the Bible got into English, and I want to hit some of the highlights for you. John Wycliffe was the first person to translate the entire Bible into English. He did that in the 1300s. He didn't use Greek and Hebrew manuscripts, though. He translated from the Latin. The first person to come along and translate into English from the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts was William Tyndale. Tyndale lived in the 1500s, and he was the first one to translate the complete New Testament into English from the Greek manuscripts. He used Erasmus' recently published Greek manuscript, and then he did some of the Old Testament after he completed the New Testament. And his work was largely taken over into the King James Version of the Bible. 90% of his words then passed into the King James Version of the Bible. He didn't complete the entire Bible, like I said, but what he did complete was hugely influential. William Tyndale. His phrases not only became standard phraseology for the Bible, but some of the phrases that William Tyndale came up with to translate the Bible have become standard stock and trade in our normal English conversation. For instance, let me give you a list of phrases that Tyndale came up with. Eat, drink, and be merry. The powers that be. Fight the good fight. My brother's keeper. Salt of the earth. A man after his own heart. All of those were phrases from William Tyndale. And now, after Tyndale was martyred, which you should read about because Tyndale's life is a remarkable story, but after he was martyred, then Miles Coverdale took Tyndale's work and revised it, and then had his disciples do additional work, and Coverdale published a complete English Bible in 1535, a revision of what Tyndale did, which was all of the New Testament and some of the Old Testament, and then Coverdale also translated from German and Latin to fill in the gaps and published a complete Bible. After Coverdale published his Bible in 1535, a series of English Bibles came in pretty rapid-fire succession, and you can read about those. I'm not going to mention them because the ones that I'm mentioning are the big three that you need to know about: Wycliffe, Tyndale, and Coverdale. The succession of English Bibles were dueling Protestant and Catholic Bibles. The Protestants would come out with a Bible that had a preface and marginal notes that were critical of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. And then the Catholics would come out with a translation, and they would have notes that were critical of the Protestants. Finally, in 1611, the King James Version of the Bible was published with the permission of King James I of England. It was a collaboration of the work of about 50 scholars, which made it the most accurate translation to date. It was popular also because it didn't have any partisan notes in the margin or preface. It wasn't strongly Catholic or strongly Protestant. It was just kind of in the middle and tried to give the Bible text for what it was without bashing the Pope or anybody else. The King James Version was the main English translation really for almost 400 years. And it wasn't until the last 40 years that we started to see a proliferation of Bible translations. But that does bring us to the last question that I'd like to address, and that is, why are there so many Bible translations? When you go to the Christian bookstore, or even when you go to Barnes & Noble, you can find all sorts of Bible translations. How do we pick a translation, and where did they all come from? The article by Clinton Arnold, It's All Greek to Me, gives good answers to these questions. But let me give you a few highlights too. One reason for the great number of translations is different manuscripts used by different translators. The King James Version, like I said a minute ago, is based on Erasmus' Greek New Testament, which was based on about 6 Greek manuscripts. That was back in the 1500s. Well, since that time, we have discovered additional Greek manuscripts, so now we have about 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, which makes it a lot easier to determine what the original text actually said and to give a more accurate version of the Bible. So versions like the ESV and the New American Standard and the NIV and a host of others are based on more accurate manuscripts than the King James Version. And different versions draw from different manuscript traditions. So that's one reason for many translations today. Another reason is there are different translation philosophies used by different Bible translators. There is one school of translating called formal equivalence. That means translating word for word as much as you can. There is a second school of thought on translating called dynamic equivalence. Dynamic equivalence translations translate thought for thought rather than word for word. They're still conveying the meaning of the original, but they're departing from the grammar and sentence structure of the original more than a formal equivalence translation. And then finally there are paraphrases. Paraphrases aren't translations, but they are just rephrasing of existing English translations to try to put them in smooth modern English. Examples of formal equivalent translations are the King James, the New King James, the New American Standard, the English Standard Version. And then dynamic equivalent translations are things like the Message, the New Living Translation, and the NIV. You can also find some paraphrases out there. I think, though, maybe to illustrate the difference between formal and dynamic equivalence, it would help to do a little bit of translation. We're not going to translate from Greek and Hebrew, but I bet that many of you know a little bit of Spanish. So think about the phrase, me gustan las manzanas. If I were going to do a formal equivalent translation of that phrase, I would say, apples please me. I'm trying to stick with the grammar and syntax of the Spanish as much as possible. Manzanas is the subject of the sentence, apples, then gustan means please, and then me is me, the direct object. So apples please me is a formal equivalent translation. A dynamic equivalent translation of me gustan las manzanas is I like apples. That's not exactly what the original Spanish is saying, with its grammar, but that's the idea of what it's trying to get across. In fact, when you take a Spanish class, they'll tell you to translate the sentence me gustan las manzanas, I like the apples, rather than apples please me, because the dynamic equivalent translation is just better in this instance because it conveys the idea more accurately. Now that's not to say dynamic equivalent are always better translations. And then finally, a paraphrase of me gustan las manzanas might be, I think apples are tasty. That's not based on the original Spanish, but that's just my taking the idea of the English translation and putting it in kind of a colloquial way. So maybe that'll help you understand the different philosophies of translation a little bit. One more note on the Arnold article. There's a spot where he tells you Greek looks like this and Hebrew looks like this, and then there's a font that's not English. That's not actually Greek and that's not actually Hebrew. I think that in the saving of that article and the posting it online, somehow the font got messed up. So don't think that what's there is Greek or Hebrew. That's just computer font gibberish. If you're interested to see real Greek or Hebrew, I can show that to you, but don't get confused. In a previous semester, there was a student that, I think in his writing assignment, copied that from the Arnold article and said this is an example of Greek or Hebrew. And it's not actually an example of Greek or Hebrew because the font's messed up. But then one last question is, what kind of translation should you use? And what kind of translation should I use? Which is best? The answer is there isn't one translation that's best. They're just different, and different types of translations are suited for different occasions. For instance, if you're going to read a large chunk of the Bible text, then a dynamic equivalent translation is good because it's more readable English and you can digest a lot of it. If you're going to do an in-depth study of one passage, I recommend a formal equivalent translation like the New American Standard or the English Standard, because you'll be able to look at individual words and get a better idea of the grammar of what the original author put. If you just need an everyday Bible, and you're going to use that Bible both for reading large chunks, for going to church, for reading out loud, and for studying in depth, then you'd probably want something kind of middle of the road. There's not just formal equivalent and dynamic equivalent in two categories. It's really more like a spectrum. The Arnold article shows you that. And some translations are way more toward dynamic equivalent and some are way more toward formal equivalent. And right in the middle, you have translations like the NIV. The NIV is a little more dynamic equivalent than formal. And then you have the Holman Christian Standard, which is a little more formal equivalent than dynamic. But both of those are kind of right in the middle of the spectrum. And so if you wanted an everyday Bible for multiple uses, those would probably be good. Well, I think that's about all that I have to tell you for this week. Sorry about the 2 separate lecture videos. I'm looking forward to our class, and I'll pray for you that God helps you balance your time and study well, and that He genuinely changes you as you study the Bible this semester.